How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
The math is clear. Lowering greenhouse gas emissions is not enough to keep the Earth below 1.5 degrees of post-industrial warming. Avoiding the most dangerous impacts of climate change means going carbon negative. To do that, researchers are looking at carbon removal, storing it in rocks, soil, trees, and even concrete. Is carbon removal a cost-effective solution to addressing climate change? Which natural and technological approaches are the most promising? We sit down with Diana Donlon, Director of Soil Centric, Mike Biddle, Managing Director at Evok Innovations, and Noah Deich, Executive Director at Carbon 180, to discuss the necessary negatives for a stable climate. Later in the show, we talk about fires in Australia, the Amazon, and elsewhere. First, going carbon negative. Noah Deich, let's begin with you. The Supreme Court of the United States has said that carbon is a pollutant that should be regulated. How do you think it should be a friend rather than a foe in the climate story?
Well, that's a great question, and it's great to be here. I think the important thing about carbon is it's not inherently bad. It's just bad when it's in the atmosphere in too great of a quantity. So when I think about carbon removal, I actually see the opportunity to take carbon that's in the atmosphere, where it's a waste, it is a pollutant when it's there in excess. But if we can figure out through innovation how to turn that waste back into a valuable product, we can take that liability and turn it back into an asset. And that's how we start all of our conversations on carbon removal, is in that frame of innovation and economic opportunity to take a problem and turn it into an opportunity.
So for hundreds of years, we've been basically taking it out of the ground, putting it up in the air, and we'll get to the back in the ground piece. So what are some ways that we can put it into something useful, into products, that sort of thing, Noah Deich?
So we can do a lot of things with it. On the technology side, many of the products that we consume today are carbon-based. We get them from the ground. But we can think about transforming how we make many of the products and materials in our built environment so that they come from the air instead. So this building, cement, the timber products in the building, all of that can sequester carbon. The fuels that we consume can come from the atmosphere. Even the clothes we wear and the food we eat can all be associated with carbon sequestration. So this is really an economy-wide opportunity to think about turning carbon back into a value.
Okay, yeah, it's the element that likes to hold hands in nature. Diana Donlon, there's a book written, The Soil Can Save Us. It's something that's gotten a lot of attention, a lot of people can relate to. So how does the soil come into this in terms of putting carbon, restoring the carbon balance?
Sure. Well, you took the words out of my mouth. I was going to say what we need to do is restore the carbon balance, because carbon, as Noah said, is always cycling through the system, and it's actually the Earth's currency. And in the atmosphere, we have it in excess and it's problematic, but we actually, at the same time, have a deficit in the soil. And so many of our soils are hungry for carbon. And Ratan Lal, who's the preeminent soil scientist on this planet, was actually at the FAO yesterday, which happened to be World Soil Day. And he was talking about the opportunity to put the carbon back in the soil, not only in the carbon sink that is the soil, but also in the vegetation. And we can get to those numbers later in the program about what the opportunity is. But to Noah's point, too, about timber and clothing and food, all that has its genesis in the soil. If you think of a tree, think of a pine cone. That falls into the ground, and that turns into a giant tree that's just from air. That's just all from photosynthesis. So we have a tremendous opportunity to work with these natural systems.
Yeah, some of the biggest optimists I meet in the climate conversations are the soil people who say we can put it back, restore that balance. Mike Biddle, why are Canadian oil companies dabbling in this area?
I think for a variety of reasons. I think many of the oil companies around the world are starting to understand that they have to be part of the solution space and not just the denial space. I think I have my own opinions about Canada being a little bit more forward-thinking than our own country, so I think that plays a role. There is policy in Canada too that, let's say, pushes them in that direction. There is a carbon tax in Canada that's been implemented, and I think that they're just looking for the future. They see the future of clean energy being different than it is today, and they want to be prepared for what that future is. They want to be a viable enterprise in the future. And I did the same with plastics. I worked with the plastics industry to solve a plastics recycling problem and the plastic in the oceans problem. And I think it's my belief that the industries that are part of the problem, if you will, need to be part of the solution as well. So I'm quite happy that they're funding us to find solutions.
Though the ocean plastics problem hasn't really been solved yet.
It hasn't.
Right? No.
It has not been solved.
Catch that one. So, but you're saying an industry kind of comes in and perhaps in some relatively, let's be honest too, some relatively small amounts of their capital outlays, right? In terms of the capital expenditure, the billions that these oil companies will invest. These are some pennies that they're kind of putting as hedges or sort of a way to kind of learn so they're not surprised.
I'd say as a percentage of their revenues, I think you could call it a small percentage, but in an absolute sense, we're one of the major investors in this space. In fact, we're one of the few investors in the world investing in negative carbon companies, early stage, risky companies, two of them right here incubated in the Bay Area that are trying to take carbon out of waste streams like flue gas, take carbon out of the air. And that's in one case, and another company trying to take that carbon and, as Noah alluded to, turn it into new materials. There's not very many companies or investment groups on the planet willing to make those risky early stage bets.
Anyone making money yet on carbon removal or using carbon as a micro Noah Deich?
Yeah, so I know a handful are.
Okay, I'd like to hear those.
I think
I think they will, but
I think they will too. And where we're seeing the first opportunities are in building materials. So figuring out how to turn CO2 back into cement, for example, you can make a stronger, better product in many cases than what exists in the market today. So those companies are closer.
I think Carbon Cure, for example, is probably the closest. I'm not sure if they're making money yet, but I think they're on a pathway to make money. So I think there are a few examples out there.
And some regenerative farmers are making money. So farmers that are using methods that improve their soil health, if they're starting with that and looking not at their yields, but looking at the health of their soil, they are actually, there are 5 principles that are universal, which underpin soil health. And farmers that really study those principles and apply them, like Gabe Brown, who's sort of the poster child for this in North Dakota, they increase their soil carbon, thereby increasing their fertility and their yields. And they will show you their books and say, hey, look, and that's their starting point. They say, we're making money, guys, so come on over to our side.
And I think that the transformation is what matters right now, not making money. We're sitting here in the Bay Area where we have tech startups who 10 years in are still not making money, and we deem them a wild success. We need to do the same thing when it comes to transforming all of these industries, not just our agriculture and food industries, but also our oil, our manufacturing industry, and the energy sector writ large. And so I think that's the right metric to think about. How are we deploying capital and bringing these innovations to scale, not necessarily will they make money right now.
We've been talking about kind of abstractions, sucking carbon out of the air. I want to bring this to kind of a more personal, human, emotional level. Diana Donlon, for about 10 days, more than 7 million Californians were breathing smoke from a climate-amplified fire. I've been gazing at climate impacts for a long time. I never thought that I would have to ask my teenage daughter, honey, do you have your mask before you walk out the front door because of the smoke of a fire hundreds of miles away. So tell us how that fire affected you, as someone who thinks about climate a lot. How did that affect you?
It was terrifying. I mean, it was terrifying for all of us, wasn't it? And one of the ironies is that I know 2 people that lost their homes up in Butte County, and one of them a guy named Chris Kirsten works with the Savory Institute, and he is working to promote solutions all over the world. He lost his dog, he lost his house. Fortunately, his wife and children were okay, but it's really traumatic. And then the other fellow that I know, we had just made a film in conjunction with an organization, my organization, Soil Centric, made with Fibershed, about the importance of grazing. And the guy who operated the drone lost his house. So I was thinking a lot about them. But when you realize how dry everything is and how this soil sponge has just been wrung out, it's not surprising. So we really do need to work with these systems, because when fire comes, we're pretty powerless, and that was demonstrated.
Noah Deich, you're a young guy embarking on a career in this. I was sitting on this stage a few days ago with someone from CAL FIRE saying there's more of this coming. There's going to be a lot more of this in your lifetime. How does that, sit with you, that the prospect of more of these fires?
Well, I can resonate with it feeling powerless to make change. But I think one of the bright spots when you think about sequestering carbon through all of these natural systems is all of a sudden we can turn what is one of these imminent challenges into opportunities for solutions. So if we figure out how we can manage our forests better, we can reduce our fire risk and sequester carbon. Sometimes that carbon can be taken out of forests and put into buildings, where it gets locked away for centuries, displacing the cement or other emissions-intensive materials. And so we get all of these cascading impacts. So we're not just helping to mitigate fires in the future, but also turning it into economic opportunity in these places that have just been devastated by some of these natural disasters.
And Mike Biddle, you have teenage kids as I do. You look at these disasters. How does that make you feel about as a parent? You ever get really worried about where we are?
Yeah, frankly, it's exactly why I do what I do. It's why I started a plastics recycling company 25 years ago. It's why I pivoted into trying to solve for a plastic waste problem to a much more persistent and difficult and much more important pollutant to recycle, and that's CO2. And that's 4 or 5 years ago, I decided I was going to focus on that instead of plastics, because it was going to impact my family. That's exactly why I did it. I was telling you a story earlier today, and I think part of this is communicating. That's why I'm so happy we're here tonight. I'm so happy you have your program. It's getting the message out in ways that people can understand it and understand the impact on their lives today, on their lives in the very near future. My daughter was at a mock Congress at her high school today, and there were 4 different Congresses. In her Congress alone, there were 2 carbon tax bills. One of them was hers, of course. And hers will, I hope, be heard tomorrow. The one that was heard today, 188 to 1. So we live in a bubble. I remind my kids all the time. We live in a bubble called the United States, called California, bubble within a bubble within the Bay Area, within the East Bay. We live in a very nice community in Walnut Creek. So we're very fortunate. I try to remind my kids that all the time, and the rest of the world is not so fortunate. And every night we say what we say we're thankful for, and I would say probably half the time is being able to live in a place where we don't often have to wear masks, and we don't want that to be our future that we're heading into. And my message to my kids is you can do something about it. It is scary. I'm sorry for what I've delivered to you, what my generation has given to you, and I'm doing everything I can to fix that.
Do you feel a little guilty about that?
I guess I don't feel guilty because I believe I walk the talk. I ride my bike everywhere. Tonight I rode my bike to the train station tonight, and I got on the train and came here. We air dry our clothes. We have solar energy. My kids don't get driven to school. They walk or bike and have ever since they were little toddlers. We try to walk the talk. I try to tell them how important that is, even though we live in a community that doesn't necessarily practice all of those behaviors. Mm-hmm. And I try to show them we've been to developing countries where they don't have the bubble that we live in. They have a different bubble that they live in, and they wear the mask every day.
Now we turn to wildfires, which broke records in the past year as they torched large swaths of land in Australia and the Amazon. This loss carries major implications for the global climate. The Amazon alone is responsible for removing 5% of the world's CO2 emissions each year. When forests like these burn, communities lose homes, access to clean air, carbon storage, biodiversity, indigenous culture, and more. As climate change and resource consumption drive higher rates of wildfires and deforestation each year, why should people care about the loss of trees they may never see? We're joined now by Corey Brinkema, President of the Forest Stewardship Council US, Tara O'Shea, Director of Forest Programs at Planet, and Paul Pazimino, Associate Director at Amazon Watch. In December of 2010, there was a climate conference in Cancun, Mexico, International Climate Conference. It was quite a time. I was there. I remember quite clearly it was after the collapse of Copenhagen, and things were pretty dark in the climate world. Some bright spots were California, and Brazil was a bright spot. Brazil was often pointed out as one of the areas where things were going in the right direction when so much in the climate was not going in the right direction. And President Lula pledged to reduce deforestation 80% by 2020. So Paul Pazimino, tell us how the Amazon and deforestation went from a leading positive story in the climate conversation to one of the real dark and sad spots.
Yeah, well, first I would say that's true to a great degree. However, at the same time, there were still and still remain challenges for the rights and protections of territories of indigenous peoples, even when deforestation rates were decreasing. And as an indigenous rights and environmental organization, that's something that always comes first when we're looking at the situation. However, it's true that with a lot of pressure and a lot of international focus and global attention, we were moving in the right direction. Brazil was moving in the right direction. Deforestation was down. Monitoring of deforestation was down, and the pressure on illegal loggers and mining, et cetera, was increased. And so agencies that were monitoring it, like IBAMA, for example, which is Brazil's environmental protection agency, were able to target and even destroy machinery that was involved in deforestation until the current regime, and things have shifted drastically in the last few years.
So Tara O'Shea, explain the fires that were in the headlines earlier in 2019. Where were they? What was causing them? Kind of refresh us on the basics here.
Yeah, I think it's really important to note that the fires that happened, and are happening at this time in the Amazon basin, the majority of which are on lands that were cleared this year. So it's sort of different from how we think of wildfires here in California or in the global north, where it tends to be from a buildup of biomass. There's a lot of pressures, as we just heard, in Brazil to clear land for agricultural production, and that's typically done in kind of a slash and burn process. And that's actually what we're seeing now, and we're seeing it in the data. There's increased amounts of forest clearing, and there's unprecedented amounts of forest fires.
And unprecedented. So there was some debate, really, actually, that it was about, whether this was really larger magnitude fires or whether it was just more increased attention to them. So if you look, over the last 10 years, there's some debate of whether these fires were really that more, it was more than last year, but, to give us, the historical context, were they really as bad as they were portrayed to be?
Yeah, I do think it's twofold. I think transparency has increased, and you see that not only with advances in Earth observation technologies, but also sort of just access to media. But that being said, it is more, and it's more than the historical baseline that we've seen, and sort of both of those factors are increased, both the clearing as well as the fires.
Tara O'Shea, capitalism is part of the problem. Do you think capitalism needs to be replaced, reformed? Because really it's the economic drivers of our retirement plans, our consumption that are driving these things we're talking about.
I think it needs to be drastically reformed and informed. I think that capitalism can measure risks if it's informed on the reality of those risks, and right now it is totally excluding the reality of environmental and social risks to the detriment of many of the most vulnerable populations amongst us. And so I do think there is a pathway whereby if we can more cost effectively and practically measure the reality of global change, then we can more practically account for it in our economic decisions, transactions. I think you'd see, we mentioned here, these are really complex problems, and many of these companies that have signed up to these targets, they're not necessarily incentivized to solve it even in their own supply chain yet. And it's really getting to the root of those incentives. And that's the way we need to be focusing our solutions.
I often say if you put Bill McKibben in the charge of a big oil company, he'd last about a week because he would do things and the shareholders would throw him out. And the shareholders would be people that everyone listening to this may be invested in through their retirement plan, or their parents are. So they're playing by certain rules. And I guess what you're saying, Tara, is they need to change those rules. Paul, do you think that capitalism needs to be overturned or can be reformed to address these harms?
It's probably no surprise that I don't think it's the solution. We're at this stage because we've treated the earth like a resource to be exploited for profit. And the only way to get out of that, from my point of view, and I believe from the perspective of many of the communities that we work with, is if we're not looking at it like a line to an end, but we have a holistic perspective on what value there is in, for example, a tree as a tree, not as something that can be tagged as this amount of carbon sequestered or oxygen produced, but the value in and of itself, the living forests. And that is pretty directly in contradiction to any capitalistic model for how we can basically pay ourselves out of this mess. We've allowed these corporations for so long to externalize all of the negative impacts of what they've been doing. And now we're reaping the benefits of it. And to turn back and say, we'll work out with you a way to do it that doesn't hurt so much, is preposterous to me. We're on the edge of a cliff, and the capitalist perspective would be, let's inch our way up little by little, and we're going to end up falling no matter what happens at that rate. It's like if you heard Greta talk at the UN, that's the kind of passion I think we need from everyone to fight back against that kind of perspective, because a radical change is necessary. And these fires in the Amazon are actually waking people up to the danger of that and the need for a radical change now. Because it's one thing to talk about, yes, we have to stop burning fossil fuels, which is true, and drastically. But it's not as visceral a reaction as you see what essentially is the lifeblood of our global weather system burning away every moment that we don't do anything to stop it. And other people are setting more fires while we talk about it. So that, I don't have the answer to, okay, capitalism isn't perfect and here's what we do, but I know that's not the solution. And if we want to sit and talk about the ways that it could be, I think in the meantime, we're spending all the time we have left to really deal with the problem.
Tara Shea, I want to switch to the Congo as an area that we haven't talked about. We've been talking a lot about the Amazon. The Congo is an area where the forest there coming out of conflict. Some interesting things are happening.
Yeah, I think in many ways the Democratic Republic of the Congo is a success case right now in terms of forest conservation. It's important to look to those optimistic places as well, I think. The DRC is one of the first countries to receive performance-based payments through the Paris mechanism, through the World Bank Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. Mozambique and Indonesia also received performance-based payments this year. And I think the DRC is an interesting case because it sort of demonstrates the possibility of a new model for economic development, right? So the DRC is coming out of a prolonged period of conflict, which led to a very low amount of engagement and development in the country, and it's coming into more stable times. And so they're looking at, how do I invest in my economy? How do I grow? How do I manage my resources? And they're doing that in concert with sort of, these new international programs that are designed to incentivize a more sustainable and green pathway to allowing your population to develop. And I think they're doing a pretty good job at that, and more importantly, they're being rewarded for it. And I think that's really critical.
Corey Brinkema, other bright spots in the management of forests around the world. We always hear about deforestation in Brazil, Indonesia. Where are some things managed well?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, maybe touch again on the Congo Basin. We've seen some recent moves, just even in the last year. The president of Gabon announcing that all of their concessions, essentially, if you're a company that wants to manage a forest for forest products, that you would have to be FSC certified in order to do so. So that's some real, I think, leadership on their part. We'll see if we can sustain that, but that's exciting for sure. I think another area. I mean, all these spaces are still fraught with risk, and there's still significant illegal logging and threats to indigenous peoples and other local communities, but. Certainly in Southeast Asia and Indonesia specifically, another place where there are significant fires and tropical deforestation. But we've seen what pressure from the consuming countries in the form of companies basically saying we're not going to retailers in the United States saying we're not going to buy tissue or paper products from companies like Asia Pulp and Paper and April to very large Indonesian/Chinese corporations that have, up until fairly recently, have been serial deforesters. And that pressure, essentially, I mean, more or less, I guess you'd call that a boycott as well, has had a significantly positive impact in some cases, almost stopping that deforestation in its tracks. And again, we've got to hold these companies accountable. Go forward. They still are highly imperfect, but again, we see them now considering the possibility of certification, wanting to play nice, I guess, with some of their major customers in places like the U.S. and Europe and Japan.
Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you podcast. Help us get more people talking about climate by giving us a rating or review. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time, everybody.